to convict.
Very narrowly bipartisan vote to convict, but it is a big disappointment for this White House, Nora. For weeks now, the White House has been saying, hey, watch a couple of these Senate Democrats. They're probably going to break the president's way. House managers simply did not make the case, and because the Trump support is so strong in those states, like West Virginia, the White House kept saying, we're probably going to get a bipartisan majority to not convict this president, and that will be its own kind of victory, quite separate from acquittal, which is the biggest issue of all. So these developments, a disappointment here at the White House, but the main issue, president is not going to be removed from office. That's an anticlimactic conclusion that was never in doubt, but the White House would have preferred to see some Democrats side with the White House.
All right, Major, thank you. Want to bring in our panel. John Dickerson is our senior political analyst and 60 Minutes correspondent. Margaret Brennan is the moderator of Face the Nation. CBS News political analyst Reince Priebus, who was President Trump's first chief of staff, and CBS News political contributor Joel Payne, a Democratic strategist. Welcome to all. John, you heard the Senate Majority Leader talk about the role of the United States Senate is essentially a way to protect against the temporary rage of causing permanent damage. Does this have an effect on the presidency?
Yes. Now, different sides will tell you what the effect is. He went all the way back to Hamilton and Jefferson. I think we're going to listen to the Majority Leader now.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2. With the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3. Faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones.
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
Article 1, 52 senators have voted not guilty, 48 guilty, which is the entire Democratic group of senators, along with one Republican senator, Mitt Romney. There is now going to be a second vote on Article 2, which is obstruction of Congress. Reince Priebus, the president's former chief of staff, is with us, and even though the president will be acquitted today and will remain in office, hearing them say guilty, it's still a stunning moment in our history.
Well, look, I think the Democrats started something they knew they couldn't finish. And there was never going to be a time when 20 Republicans were going to convict a president of something that we've talked a lot about, the articles that they didn't meet the threshold, and they were going to go for it.
Senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. Two-thirds of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Enzi. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Ms. Harris. Guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Not guilty. Mr. Jones. Guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Not guilty. Mr. King. Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Guilty. Mr. Langford. Not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Guilty. Mr. Markey. Guilty. Mr. McConnell. Not guilty. Ms. McSally. Not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Guilty. Mr. Merkley. Guilty. Mr. Moran. Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Guilty. Mrs. Murray. Guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Not guilty. Mr. Peters. Guilty. Mr. Portman. Not guilty. Mr. Reed. Guilty. Mr. Risch. Not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Not guilty. Mr. Romney. Not guilty. Ms. Rosen. Guilty. Mr. Rounds. Not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Guilty. Mr. Sass. Not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Guilty. Mr. Schumer. Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Guilty. Mr. Shelby. Not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Guilty. Ms. Smith. Guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Not guilty. Mr. Tester. Guilty. Mr. Thune. Not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Not guilty. Mr. Udall. Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Guilty. Mr. Warner. Guilty. Ms. Warren. Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Guilty. Mr. Wicker. Not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Guilty. Mr. Young. Not guilty.
The President of the United States will remain in office as senators have voted in the majority to hold the president not guilty on Articles 1 and 2 in the articles of impeachment passed by a Democratic House of Representatives, largely along party lines, except for one exception. Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, who voted with Democrats on Article 1, which is abuse of power, where he voted
On this
guilty.
article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. Two-thirds of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State, as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel to commemorate his time presiding over this body. We typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. The page is delivering the gavel.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, the fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day. But the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The Chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the Chief Chamber Attendant. Jim Hoover and the cabinet shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Byrd, Brenda Byrd and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team who moved the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant-at-Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
And thus ends the era of impeachment against President Donald Trump, as the president has been acquitted on both charges, both articles of impeachment against the president, including abuse of power and obstruction of justice. Want to go to Major Garrett, our chief Washington correspondent, with reaction from there at the White House. Major?
Not from the White House yet, Nora, but from the Trump-Pence campaign 2020. This statement delivered by the campaign chairman, Brad Parscale. President Trump, I quote directly from the statement, has been totally vindicated, and now it's time to get back to the business of the American people. I'm reading again, direct quote. The do-nothing Democrats know they can't beat him, so they had to impeach him. This terrible ordeal was always a campaign tactic to invalidate the 2016 votes of 63 million Americans and was a transparent effort to interfere with the 2020 election. It goes on to say, President Trump's fundraising only grew more robust during this impeachment process. That's certainly what the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign have always represented. And there is some indication, Nora, the president's approval rating in a series of polls also ticked up slightly as the impeachment process wore on.
All right, Major, thank you. Want to bring in our panel, John Dickerson, our senior political analyst and 60 Minutes correspondent, Margaret Brennan, the moderator of Face the Nation, CBS News political analyst Reince Priebus, who is President Trump's first chief of staff, and CBS News political contributor Joel Payne, a Democratic strategist. Joel, first to you. You hear the response, first not from the White House, but from the president's campaign manager, who took a look at this last poll numbers and showed that the president's support, even among his base, actually has grown. One of his best approval ratings thus to date. What do the Democrats do now?
Well, I think that's significant what you say, that the campaign responded first. It's clear that the president's on a war footing, so to speak, where it relates to impeachment. I think the most significant thing out of today is Mitt Romney stepping out against the Republican Party, not just against this president, but providing cover to people like Joe Manchin, like Kyrsten Sinema, who are considering probably crossing over and maybe voting to vote not guilty against this president. That cover takes them off the hook in the short term, and long term allows Democrats to make the argument that this was a bipartisan guilty vote, which is something that's very significant that I think coming into this day, I'm not sure how many prognosticators thought that was something that was possible.
And Ryan, let me ask you about that. The president will have on his record that he was impeached for history. He will also have that he was acquitted by the Senate. And yet there were strong statements from a number of Republicans, not just Mitt Romney, who said, yes, the president did commit a high crime and misdemeanor. He asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. You had Susan Collins tell us that the president was wrong, that it was improper. You heard from Rob Portman. You've heard from a number of Republican senators. Do you think President Trump learned anything, or there's a lesson he took from this?
Well, I mean, I think that the reality is that senators have to look at these exercises in the whole. And when every single Democrat voted for, except for 3, the articles of impeachment, no Republicans, this whole impeachment fiasco started in a completely partisan fashion, and it pretty much ended in a partisan fashion. When something this big in this country starts off in a completely partisan way, the American people shut it down. And these senators are accountable to those same American people. So Republicans get in their corner, Democrats get in their corner, and the reality is the rest of the country is hardly paying attention to this. So is there a lesson? I don't think so. I think that the fact of the matter is this is a political exercise. Last night was another political exercise of the State of the Union, different topic, but it's clearly seen that the politics in this country is already in their corners. 2020 has started, and I think in a month or two, no one is going to be talking about this. You saw David Axelrod said the other day, he was in a Democrat focus group, and it was only Democrats, and they were talking about what matters in 2020. It wasn't until the 84th minute that the topic of impeachment even came up in a politically charged discussion among Democrats.
Mm-hmm. You know, Nora, you brought up what does this mean for the presidency, and what Reince is saying is a version of what Mitch McConnell said, which is you shouldn't have a partisan process, and the system worked. It stopped the partisanship from an abuse of power, which is what McConnell was arguing. But there's also another way to look at this, which is there's been a lot of discussion about following the right process. The president's lawyer said the House didn't follow the right process, and that was bad. Well, the president didn't follow the right process either. He didn't follow it on Ukraine policy, and he didn't follow it with respect to investigating a U.S. citizen. That's not the Democrats saying that. That's all the people you named who said it was wrong, inappropriate. There's maybe 2/3 vote for saying he did something wrong. So what happens in the American system when a president does something wrong, shameful, inappropriate? How do you deal with that? And that is an open question now after this process. If it's not impeachment, what is the venue for handling a president who Republicans have said did something wrong, shameful, and inappropriate?
The ballot box. The ballot box.
Could be.
Right.
And now it is the ballot box.
Right. But the question is, at the center of the American experience, or at the Constitution, is balance of power. Mm-hmm. Do you only balance the power every 4 years? That's not the way the system was designed. What's the intermediate question?
And Nora, I mean, Mitt Romney's words were very strong. He didn't just say abuse of power as written there. Yeah. He said this is a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security interests, and our fundamental values. And that fundamental values question is something we don't talk a lot about right now. But when you think back to covering the Clinton impeachment, you heard a lot of, particularly from Republicans, frustration about the integrity of the office being sullied here. And this time around, you heard from at least 5 Republicans, well, they thought the president did do it. They just heard the calculation, it wasn't worth removing him from office. And you think back to, if we do look, if the true test is the next election, that question, you've brought it up a few times, is sort of what's the new benchmark for acceptable behavior for a president, whoever that president is after this next election.
To add to what Romney said, in fact, too, as well as corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of the oath of office that I can imagine, in his words.
Well, the benchmark is in the Constitution. Bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And where they're listed is in Title 18 of the U.S. Code, which lists all the different crimes under the criminal procedure of the federal government. And abuse of power and obstruction of Congress isn't in there. I mean, this whole thing was flawed from the beginning. They didn't articulate a crime in the articles of impeachment. And to the point that you're discussing, many senators rested on the position that even if everything the Democrats said is true, you don't remove someone from the ballot in 2020.
Take us inside the White House. What's the president likely doing right now?
I think that he's probably very frustrated with Senator Romney. I do think that getting all the Republicans on board would have been a nice plus to all of this this fiasco. But I think they're getting ready to move on, and I think that they feel good about last night. I think they feel great about the campaign, and they're happy it's over.
Very, very frustrated is a good descriptor for it. I would also add, too, you're left to wonder if the president would have accepted some measure of, rebuke, whether it's a censure or just to acknowledge publicly, like Bill Clinton did, I did something wrong. I'm somewhat learning on the job. I'm not saying this is a Democrat. I believe it, but you wonder if Romney would feel less pressure to maybe vote to convict. You wonder if the Lamar Alexanders of the world and the Lisa Murkowskis of the world, if they would feel less pressure to go out of their way to rebuke the president. That's something that this White House has to consider as well.
John Dickerson and I used to cover the White House together, know each other for a long time. I can remember a very famous question that John Dickerson asked the president, George W. Bush, about, can you name a mistake that you made? Am I getting that right? Yeah. And he was reluctant. He could not think of a mistake he made. It's very hard for presidents to admit wrongdoing or even a mistake that they've made, especially Trump, too.
Yeah, and although he was trying in good faith effort to come up with an answer, I think the existing president has often said that he doesn't look back on mistakes that way. We don't want to leave people with the misimpression that you have to commit a crime for it to be impeachable. We know that the vast majority of legal scholars say that that's the case. The National Review does, and so on. But moving on to Mitt Romney.
I follow Jonathan Turley's analysis.
I think Jonathan Turley also says it doesn't have to be a crime.
Yeah, Dershowitz is the only one who is sort of out there on an island.
Right, and even that might not be the case with him anymore. But on Mitt Romney, everybody who knows Mitt Romney in the Republican Party knows he's a man of conscience and faith. And they may disagree with the product of his discernment, may think it was the wrong thing to do, but presumably every other Republican senator consulted their conscience and their faith and came up with their decision. So now that Mitt Romney is being vilified, Don Jr. Has said he should be kicked out of the Republican conference, those other Republican senators who relied on their conscience as well presumably would stand up for their colleague, may not agree with this decision, but his right to ask his conscience and come up with a verdict. We'll see if it happens.
You're raising the question about whether you'll hear from other Republicans saying that's Romney's choice.
Right. He may be wrong. I disagree with it, but it is his right as a senator to consult his conscience and his God and come up with what he thinks is the decision, and that doing so is at the core of our jobs and not something for which you should be run out of the Republican conference just because you did it in a way we didn't like it.
Can we talk about that? Because I think no matter what side you fall on, there is a bit of people are tired of impeachment, in part because they're more interested in the pocketbook issues at home. You can hear from the Democratic Party. We heard from Speaker Pelosi yesterday saying the three most important issues of the Democratic Party are health care, health care, and health care. The president last night didn't talk about impeachment. He talked about issues that he believes he's done well on and perhaps wants to address in the future. How does anything get done when the President of the United States has absolutely no relationship with the Speaker of the House? In fact, it seems the two of them hate one another.
And they just speak past each other, even on those issues and concepts of common interest, like we talked about during the State of the Union, the lowering prescription drug prices and the like. I think the expectations could not be lower for any kind of legislation. However, you have had these olive branches with Speaker Pelosi. The White House handed her a pretty big capitulation in terms of some changes on biologics and the like with that North American free trade deal. She did extend a bit of a hand, but as we saw visibly in front of the cameras last night, that hand was not accepted. And as it ended with her tearing up that State of the Union, I think that really sums up it's lowered expectations for the next 9 months as we go into this election season.
Nancy, as someone who
partisanship.
Nancy Cordes is on Capitol Hill, and someone who covers the Capitol so well and follows Speaker Pelosi is at every single one of her press conferences. Was this out of character for her?
It was, Nora. In fact, Speaker Pelosi is often the one lecturing her fellow Democrats to show decorum, not to get overheated, particularly at these high drama moments. And so the fact that she ripped up the pages of this speech, not just once but twice, was definitely out of character for her. A number of Democrats I spoke to today came to her defense, even as they acknowledged that it was unusual, and both sides are still smarting over it. In fact, the Senate's Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, just said right before this vote that perhaps Speaker Pelosi will tear up this verdict the way she tore up the State of the Union speech. So the bad feelings that you've been talking about are going to continue, especially because while impeachment may now be behind us, the investigations are not. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler just said this morning that the House does indeed plan to subpoena John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, to testify before the House because he was not called before the Senate. The House is still seeking to get a hold of the president's tax records, his financial records. They could win those court cases this year. And so, the two sides are still going to be on a war footing here for months to come.
And we're just watching Senator Joe Manchin talking to reporters at the Ohio Clock, explaining his vote. Many had thought that the Democratic senator from West Virginia, the former governor of West Virginia, might be someone who would vote to acquit the president of the United States, but ultimately he sided with his own party and voted guilty on both articles of impeachment. John, where do you see this president heading from here? Does he move on from the fact that he was impeached? Does he continue to mention it as a way to hammer his opponents?
I think he'll use it as, I can't imagine, having watched him, that he won't take occasional impeachment detours. I think if he keeps it in the box of, they spent all this, wasted all this time, I've achieved all these results, it's a nice second beat for him to his base to talk about, think of what more we could have gotten done if they weren't on top of me. I think where he, and Chairman Priebus can weigh in on this, where it might be a problem politically for the president is if he lets his lack of self-restraint get away with him, and he starts taking on Nancy Pelosi and doing other things that will be politically damaging for him with important constituency groups he's trying to win back. That's where it'll be a challenge for him.
We call him Chairman Priebus because before he was Chief of Staff, he was Chairman of the Republican National Committee. The president's speech last night, many people called it the first big speech of campaign 2020, including the chants from the chamber of 4 more years for the President of the United States. What did you make of the construction of that speech?
I thought it was the launch of the 2020 campaign. I thought that it was pretty raw. It was well, it was glitzy. It was well produced. And I thought it got under the skin of every Democrat. They were raging as time went on, and it was the type of theater that if you're a Republican, you're watching it, you're getting more and more excited as everything's moving along. Everything from school choice, the choice, to bring that up, to have that great little girl there, should have forced the Democrats to stand and clap for a little girl, the reunion of the veteran, and then the in-your-face Rush Limbaugh honor from the balcony. I mean, it was perfectly designed, I think, to launch the 2020 campaign and to just drive the Democrats nuts. And they did it, and Nancy Pelosi cracked. And what the Democrats have to understand is President Trump has the privilege of being judged through the lens of Trump, not the lens of what we all wish, something or somebody would be, but the lens of Trump. And he gets to do things that other people don't get to do, and it just is what it is.
And Joel, we will fact-check some of the remarks that the president made and some of the things that he laid out. But what about the point that Reince makes there, that it was driving Democrats nuts? It sure looked like it, looking at their faces.
Yeah, in my brief time, I won't try to fact-check everything in that speech. It was very well produced, and I'll be candid. It was the best I've heard this president deliver his own message. A buddy of mine, Doug High, who's a former spokesperson for the Republicans in the Senate, said on Twitter, if he gives this speech every day for the next 9 months, he'll win. And I wrote back, yeah, and he won't. And that's exactly how I feel. Donald Trump does not have the political discipline or the maturity to deliver that message every day. And Reince, you can speak to that better than anybody.
Wait a minute. I will say this. After Access Hollywood weekend in 2016, the president went on a 3-week, 5-speech-a-day, no media interviews, not one, all the way through the election day, and obviously shocked the world. So he can do that in you know, I wouldn't count him out at all to do what he did last night, at least more consistently.
And Joel, do you think that Democrats fell into the Trump trap?
I think the speaker acted out of character. That was off-brand for her. That was not. She has countered Donald Trump so well because she's kept her cool, and she's advised her caucus not to lose their cool. And so that was certainly off-brand for her. I would deign mention that anyone crack Nancy Pelosi. I don't think anybody who's watched her wrestle with Donald Trump over the last 3 years would say she's cracked.
She didn't do well.
Madam Speaker, thank you to everyone. Once again, President Donald Trump has been acquitted by the Senate on both articles of impeachment. Our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app. There will be more on your local news on this CBS station and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. Thanks to our correspondents and our panelists. I'm Norah O'Donnell, CBS News, Washington.